Let's begin by talking briefly about your book, In Search of the Elusive Zimbabwean Dream, Volume 2. I think it's called The Path to Power. Why elusive?
Well, in Zimbabwe, we have been trying to create an environment where we have democracy, freedom of expression, shared economic prosperity, economic growth that's sustainable. This has been very difficult. This has been unachievable so far. So when we say elusive dream, we are saying our efforts have not succeeded in creating a peaceful, prosperous and democratic Zimbabwe. Now, this is volume 2, which concentrates on the efforts, the journey towards influence, the efforts and the contributions by my colleagues and others as we tried to make a difference in Zimbabwe. It's a series of 3 books, book 1, book 2, and book 3. So right now we're on book 2, which is the journey towards influence, efforts that we carried out to democratize Zimbabwe and create a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Zimbabwe, which has been so far unachievable.
And part of what the book looks at is the elections in Zimbabwe, the most recent one. I mean, does it look at the elections, or it applies the lessons from your experience to those elections in 2018?
Yeah, so although ostensibly we cover the period from 2003 to 2009, we pick up lessons from that period and apply them to the experiences of 2018. The activities of the opposition, the rigging of elections, the response to the rigging, and also what should be done. So it is an effort to actually apply lessons beyond the period that we cover and say what can be done now to make sure that the opposition and the people of Zimbabwe can leverage the experiences we went through and create a better Zimbabwe in terms of political stability, in terms of democracy, and in terms of creating shared economic prosperity in Zimbabwe. There are lessons for what's happening right now in Zimbabwe and also what should be done on the way forward. All this is articulated in the book.
Well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Zimbabwe in a moment, but I just want to go back to volume 1 of your book, In Search of the Elusive Zimbabwean Dream, because it's a much broader sort of perspective on what's happening not just in Zimbabwe, but across Africa. Presumably that elusiveness that you talk about in micro with regard to Zimbabwe can be extrapolated in macro across the whole continent of Africa.
Totally correct. You know, when we say the Zimbabwean dream, we are ostensibly talking about the African dream. Why? Because peace has been elusive in Africa. Why? Democracy, freedom, and economic prosperity have been elusive in Africa. So the Zimbabwean dream is actually an African dream, because in most of these African countries, a peaceful, prosperous and democratic nation has been absent. So we are learning from Zimbabwe, but the ideas are applicable to Malawi, to Nigeria, to Ethiopia, to Somalia. Africans must work together to create a democratic environment, to create shared economic prosperity in their environment. So yes, the Zimbabwean dream, which has been elusive, is ostensibly an African dream.
Well, you mentioned Nigeria there. I'd like to talk to you about that in a minute. Nigeria, of course, where the political waters are getting rather choppy at the moment. But let's return to the dream. That dream that you talked about as being elusive did not elude you, because you grew up to become arguably one of Zimbabwe's highest achievers, a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, holder of a doctorate degree in robotics and mechatronics, research scientist with the US Space Agency, NASA, and of course, Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. I mean, is that the essence of that first volume of the book, which is that talent and hard work can change lives, and that once those lives have been changed, they can go on to change the lives of their countries?
Yes, we're emphasizing hard work. Yes, we're emphasizing personal agency. Yes, we're saying that if we work hard, if we apply our minds, if we believe in education, we can succeed. However, we're saying it's not enough. Personal success is not enough. What we want is collective success. The meaning of life for me, the meaning of life for all these successful Africans should be, how is my country doing? How is my continent doing? You will never be respected as an African until the African continent has done well as a continent. So yes to personal success, but we must now move from personal success to significance. This is why we are saying now, how do we become change makers in Nigeria? How do we become change makers in South Africa? How do we become change makers in Zimbabwe, in the African continent, so that our countries are doing well, so that the continent of Africa is doing well? So the book 2 now talks about how I tried, by working with others, to create a new Zimbabwe. How we should, as Africans, work together to achieve collective success, to achieve national success, as opposed to personal success. It's not enough to be successful as an individual. We must prosper together as nations.
Well, absolutely. And of course, for lives, as you correctly pointed out there, to be changed, at least, for majority of those in Africa, I mean, there has to be a conducive environment for that to happen. I mean, that includes economic development, political stability, and political inclusiveness. I mean, to what extent are you seeing that taking place in Africa?
It's work in progress. It's work in progress. We want political stability. We want democracy. But more importantly now, we want shared economic prosperity. We want shared economic growth. The agenda now in Africa is about prosperity. We want the African to be prosperous. So on the foundation of democracy, on the foundation of political stability, we want economies that work. We want to leverage technology. We want to leverage the fourth industrial revolution in pursuit of shared economic prosperity. It's work in progress, but there's a lot of work to be done until we reach the promised land.
Well, let's talk about work that's being done, and let's talk specific countries now. Lots of mixed messages appearing to come out of the continent right now in terms of political and democratic development. As I said, we'll talk about your country, Zimbabwe, in a moment, as well as Nigeria. But we've seen the first peaceful transfer of power in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, despite clear reservations about the credibility of the elections that brought Felix Tshisekedi to office. I mean, Martin Fayulu, his rival, very disgruntled, as is the influential Catholic Church in the DRC. Does peace there now depend to some extent on who Mr. Tshisekedi decides to pick for his cabinet, and whether it is a cabinet of inclusion?
The starting point is to acknowledge that there is progress. There's been change of power from one regime to another through an election. That is progress. We must celebrate that. However, we must also ask about the content of the change. Does it mean new values? Does it mean a new culture? Does it mean a new system? Does it mean new institutions? The change in Africa must have both form and substance. Sometimes we are caught up on the form. We don't discuss the content. And as a result, we keep going through circles. We want to make sure in the DRC, there's a new value system that embraces democracy, freedom of expression, a new value system that embraces constitutionalism, a new value system that destroys and removes corruption and adopts meritocratic based management. We want a new value system in the DRC that says never again should we have an autocratic arrangement where the people have no say. Going forward, it would be great if he can put together an inclusive government so that those who are in disagreement, those who are disappointed by the elections, also have a role to play. So yes, it is important for Tshisekedi to be inclusive and national in his approach. But more importantly, we want the change in the DRC to have both form and substance. We are sick and tired of being sick and tired of change in Africa that has no content. And that will come clear when we look at Nigeria and Zimbabwe, that the change took place in Nigeria, the change took place to some extent in Zimbabwe, but there was no foundational change in the values. We need a change in the values, a change in the institutions, and the change in the culture of governance. We hope the DRC won't be a forced moment.
Well, that's a very good point. But of course, let's talk about Zimbabwe now. These were the types of issues that led to the creation of a government of national unity in your country, Zimbabwe, in which you were deputy prime minister under sort of Morgan Tsvangirai and Robert Mugabe. I mean, that arrangement, of course, collapsed. Many years later, Mr. Mugabe was ousted from office to be replaced by his former deputy Emerson Mnangagwa, who recently won a disputed election. And of course, today we're still talking about the same things. I mean, state repression, clamp down on the opposition, economic hardship, and lack of opportunity. So that new dawn of Zimbabwe that you envisaged when you tried to work with Robert Mugabe, yet to materialize.
Yes, the challenge is number one, as an inclusive government, we were not able to deliver the reforms of our politics, reforms of our electoral laws, reforms that would have allowed for free and fair elections. So that was the major failure of the arrangement. But more importantly, we must understand that in 2017 in Zimbabwe, there was a coup d'etat. You can never build a democracy on the foundation of a coup d'etat. Mugabe was taken out by a coup d'etat. But what happened in 2017 was the removal of Mugabe the person. Mugabe the system, or what we call Mugabeism, continues to exist in Zimbabwe. The culture, the value system, the way of doing things, the institutions and the culture that Mugabe put in place are still there in the country. So, the coup d'etat in 2017 was a false dawn, was a faulty and flawed arrangement on which to base any new value system. Now, in 2018, we had an election along the same lines of rigging, manipulation, and unfair and unfree elections. Again, the culture of running elections, the value system of rigging, that was presided over by Mugabe was the one that was operational in 2018. Consequently, the outcome of that election in 2018 July was challenged by the opposition. Why? Because it was flawed, it was rigged. So we must make sure that when we say we have a new dispensation in Zimbabwe, it's a dispensation that talks about constitutionalism, new values, new systems, new ways of doing things. Nothing has changed in Zimbabwe. The very same people who used to work with Mugabe, the enforcers of Mugabe, are the ones in charge of the country. So you don't expect anything different under Mnangagwa, because Mnangagwa was an enforcer and is a poor replica of Robert Mugabe. So that's why I emphasize that the change in Africa must have both form and substance. We must make sure we address the issue of new values, new culture, new institutions, so that we can say we now have a new dispensation. So all this we talk about in the book. We are saying in Zimbabwe, the foundation was flawed. The elections in 2018 were challenged by the losers. And more importantly, the economic crisis has not been addressed. Mnangagwa and his government are clueless on the economy. They're not concentrating on the economy. They're already talking about 2023. They're managing their own party factions and factional fights as opposed to organizing around the economy. So these are some of the challenges we find at play in Zimbabwe. It's not a new dispensation. The system that Mugabe put in place, the values and the culture are still in place, not yet Uhuru in Zimbabwe.
And of course, Mr. Former Deputy Prime Minister, on the other side of the continent, I mean, huge political tensions in Nigeria at present, with the suspension of the Chief Justice by President Buhari and global condemnation trailing that suspension amid fears that it is a calculated attempt to influence the outcome of the upcoming elections due in less than 3 weeks in favor of Mr. Buhari and his ruling APC party. Do you share the view of the British, the Americans and the EU, as well as the Nigerian opposition, that democracy is once again under threat in Nigeria? Does Nigeria face anarchy if the suspension of the Chief Justice is allowed to stand so close to the elections?
We don't have to use the British and the Europeans as a reference point. I don't have to share their views. I share African views. Here are the African views. When we celebrated the victory of Buhari, when we celebrated the change, the democratic change from one regime to another in Nigeria, what were we celebrating? Were we celebrating the person of Buhari? Were we celebrating the superficial and the change in Nigeria of personnel? That was wrong. That was a false moment. When we say democracy has taken place in Nigeria, when we say Buhari has won, we have a new dispensation, we must make sure that we are now moving into a new culture where democracy is respected, where constitutionalism is respected, where freedom of association is respected, where corruption is abhorred. Now, the challenge is that sometimes we get caught up in celebrating individuals. Buhari has won after so many efforts. Now we have a new dispensation in Nigeria. Wrong. That's a false consciousness. What we should do is to make sure that when we do have our transitions, we are clear on the change in the culture of governance, the change in the system of governance, the change in the institutions of running the country. So what we see happening under Buhari tells us that there was never a change in the value systems of Nigeria under Buhari. There was never a change in the culture of constitutionalism, the separation of powers. The judiciary, the legislature, and the executive were never separate. You see that in this action of suspending the Chief Justice. So all the time, when we work on our systems in Africa, we don't have to worry about the Europeans and the British. They are not the reference point. We are our own liberators. We ourselves must be smart enough to know that change must have both form and substance. And the substance is what will deliver a new dispensation. So in Nigeria, we say the struggle continues. We must make sure when we have our change in Nigeria, we are talking about the rule of law. We are talking about constitutionalism. We're talking about embracing democracy. We're talking about removing and fighting corruption. We're talking about shared economic prosperity among the Nigerians. We're talking about shared economic growth. Change must have both form and substance. Don't get caught up on celebrating the form of change like we did in Nigeria by celebrating Buhari. It was just form, not substance.
And just given your experience and knowledge of politics across the continent, I mean, with so much division here in Nigeria, so close to the elections, how can some measure of trust be restored?
I think we can't give up. We must keep fighting. We must keep the struggle going. The Nigerians must be masters of their own destiny. The Nigerians must understand that they have to work together. They have to work on their country. No one from Europe, no one from Britain will come to solve Nigeria's problems. The Nigerians are going to be masters of their own destiny. But more importantly, let us put more emphasis on the regional blocks, ECOWAS, COMESA, EAC, SADC, but more importantly, the African Union. The survival of the African continent is going to be continental integration, African unity. We're going to survive as Africans working together. When we work together, we're talking about 1.2 billion Africans. We're talking about $2.3 trillion GDP. Nigeria and South Africa must actively support the African Free Continental Trade Area and emphasize that the success of the continent under globalization will depend on regional integration, will depend on continental integration, because now we are talking about continental competitiveness. We're talking about continental attractiveness. Nigeria won't be attractive if Ghana is not attractive. South Africa won't be attractive if Malawi and Zimbabwe are not attractive. We as Africans are going to sink or swim together. Our destiny is linked, and we must now talk about 21st century Pan-Africanism, which is rooted in economics, in technology, entrepreneurship, and good old-fashioned African unity. So yes to addressing problems in Nigeria, yes to addressing problems in the DRC, yes to addressing problems in Zimbabwe, but we must also think Pan-African. We must think continental and say the African must embrace continental integration, and we push volumes. We must not negotiate as individual countries with China. Nigeria negotiating with China, Botswana negotiating with China. No, you get shortchanged. Why don't we approach China as a continent of 1.2 billion people, GDP $2.3 trillion? Why don't we approach India, America, and EU as one block? That way, we can effectively negotiate and get better terms. Can you imagine if we have a diamond cluster with Botswana, Angola, Zimbabwe, and South Africa working together around diamonds? A platinum cluster, Zimbabwe and South Africa together. And the same applies to gold and oil and so on. That way, we have scale and leverage. We'll be able to extract better deals from China, better deals from India, better deals from Russia, and from Europe when we're working together as a bloc. Africans must embrace continental integration, and that way we'll be able to survive under globalization. We must embrace the fourth industrial revolution. Technology is an equalizer. There's a notion of leapfrogging, where we can drive and jump older technologies and go straight to artificial intelligence, big data, Internet of Things, nanotechnologies, and all these other new things are possible vehicles to drive African economies if we are clever and organized about it.
And that's the big question, of course, because, I mean, just returning to the context of Nigeria, as you said, the biggest economy in Africa, I mean, for it to move along that trajectory, there's got to be political stability. There's got to be a lack of sort of corruption. And looking at the current situation here now, less than 3 weeks to go to crucial presidential elections, the debacle around the suspension of the Chief Justice, President Buhari saying that far from being politically motivated, that his decision to suspend the Chief Justice was taken to protect the integrity of the judiciary, because according to him, it's beginning to look increasingly like the Nigerian judiciary is an institution that appears to support corruption. I mean, beyond the politics, you know, how embarrassing is it for any country to find their Chief Justice entangled in corruption allegations?
Now, it's a tricky situation, but we don't accept Buhari's explanation because we must believe in the functional separation of powers. The legislature, the judiciary, and the executive must be separate. So when you do suspend the Chief Justice, you're undermining constitutionalism. You're violating the separation of powers. So we don't accept Buhari's explanation. So we reject that. What we want to see in Africa is the rule of law. We want to see constitutionalism in Africa. But more importantly, we want to see leadership. Nigeria has failed to show leadership in Africa. For them to refuse to sign the Free Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a shame. Buhari has failed as a leader. He must understand that Nigeria needs Africa. South Africa has failed as well because the deal was signed on the 21st of March 2018. South Africa only signed later. The two big powers are irresponsible. They failed to show leadership. Nigeria and South Africa, shame on you. So what we want in Nigeria is political stability, yes. We must fight corruption, yes. We want economic prosperity, yes. But we also want leadership in Nigeria. It's missing. So I hope the opposition candidates in Nigeria become leaders who embrace Pan-Africanism, who embrace the continent, in addition to embracing constitutionalism, in addition to embracing democracy, and also pushing for shared economic prosperity in Nigeria and in Africa. So we want to see leadership in Nigeria. It's missing at the moment.
And finally, former Deputy Prime Minister, we appreciate your time here. Just returning to your book about the elusiveness of the Zimbabwean dream, which is, of course, a trilogy. You've just released book 2. Give us a sneak preview of what we can expect in book 3.
In book 3, we're going to concentrate on the answers, on the solutions. How do we solve the problems in Africa? What are the frameworks? What are the strategies we can put in place to solve the African problems? How do we deploy technology? How do we leverage the 4th Industrial Revolution? So volume 3 is about solutions, solutions, and solutions. And so we're building on the journey to influence. We're building on the efforts to make a difference and now concentrating on the answers, on the ideas, on the solutions we can put in place to drive Africa. But as I've explained earlier on, although it's a Zimbabwean dream, it's actually an African dream. The issues we are addressing in the books affect all African countries. They affect Nigeria, DRC, South Africa, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. So we are now concentrating on the solutions that can be used to create a successful, peaceful, prosperous, and democratic African nation, which is characterized by democracy, constitutionalism, the rule of law, but more importantly, shared economic prosperity. That's the agenda in book 3.
On that note, Professor Arthur Mutambara, former Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe and author of the new book, In Search of the Elusive Zimbabwean Dream, thank you very much indeed.